What could be done in a region where growth is urgently needed and where infrastructure is required to boost that growth? However, it is clear that many of our governments do not have the fiscal space to finance these types of investments. Furthermore, in some jurisdictions, there is the anomaly where governments are highly indebted, but at the same time there are high levels of liquidity in the financial sector. Last year, governors asked what could be done to alleviate these pressing problems. We therefore took it upon ourselves at the bank and at the economics department within the bank to examine one of the possible solutions to this problem: how to encourage greater private sector involvement in the provision of public goods. And here we'll be presenting the findings of this research, PPPs, building on early lessons. To discuss the topic, we have assembled a panel of 5 experts. We will hear perspectives from government and the state sector, private sector, and multilaterals. Our panel includes Mr. Carl Howell, economist with the Caribbean Development Bank, with overall responsibility for managing this particular piece of research. His presentation will give an overview of the major elements of the study on public-private partnerships in the Caribbean. Our second panelist, Mr. Richard Caballo, Manager, Latin America and the Caribbean International Finance Corporation, Advisory Services and Public-Private Partnerships, will present perspectives from IFC on PPP lessons for the Caribbean. The third panelist, Mr. Jamel Sobas, Sector Specialist, Sovereigns and Infrastructure with CIBC First Caribbean Investment Bank, will present to us on structuring finance for Caribbean growth, the case of PPPs. Fourth, we'll hear from Mr. Ivan Anderson, Managing Director, National Road Operating and Construction Company, who will present us with a case study in Jamaica on Highway 2000. Finally, we will hear from Mr. Winston Brassington, Chief Executive Officer, Guyana Holding Company for Investment, and he will present a case study on Guyana, the Amelia Falls hydropower project. The panel discussion will take the following format. Each presenter will be asked to come to the podium and give their presentation. We've allotted about 10 to 12 minutes of time for them. At the end of the 5th presentation, I will then open up the floor for questions and answers and to have a lively discussion, hopefully. At the end of the discussion, I will summarize some of the major findings of the discussion from today's seminar and close from there. So we're hoping to have a very useful and fruitful discussion. We will try to allocate the majority of the time for your questions. And so without further ado, I'll ask the first presenter to come to the podium, Mr. Carl Howell.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to everyone. As Justin said, I'll present on the recent study commissioned by CDB in terms of the plan of some technology challenges here. This is it. I don't think this is it. I think we've got the wrong piece of technology here. Let's give us a second.
Is the same one you use?
I don't know.
Let me get one of the guys.
Yeah. I mean, I could present and ask the guys upstairs to click for me. Yeah. Okay. In terms of the plan for the presentation, we'll go through quickly the rationale for the research work. Speak a little about closing the infrastructure gaps in the region using PPPs or P3s, 3Ps. We'll talk a little bit about some early lessons from PPPs, and then ask the question, how can we make PPPs work better for the region? What has been, if you want, a problem for Caribbean economies in the past in trying to utilize PPPs is the whole question of fiscal surprises. We'll pay a little attention to that as well, and then talk a little bit about a possible role for CDB going forward. Click. Clicking, but I'll continue. Essentially, the report is intended to make a contribution. Good. The report is intended to make a contribution to improve the understanding of P3s, or the 3P model for supporting Caribbean development. We believe that a prima facie case has been made for the worth of P3s. This notwithstanding, some countries have had missteps in relation to the utilization of the instrument. In large measure, the report argues that these early missteps, to some extent, erodes the appeal and as well diminish the value of using the instrument. But against that backdrop, as was mentioned several times this morning, and as mentioned by the chair just now as well in his introduction, given that levels in the region where a number of countries carry debt levels in excess of 60% of GDP, some indeed in excess of 100%. And in trying to consolidate fiscal positions, what we are finding is that capex or investment levels are being squeezed. The question, therefore, that begs itself is how can we utilize P3s to fill the infrastructure gap that we mentioned early on. In terms of the missteps that were made by some countries, we've argued, and the report argues, that largely it reflects differences in knowledge sets in countries. Countries with some degree of capacity to carry and to utilize the instruments, they've had good outcomes. Countries with less capacity have had less fortunate outcomes as well. The report therefore seeks to tap the good experiences indeed in the region and outside of the region in an effort to close the knowledge gaps in the region. In addition to that, we believe that the report and the information contained therein represents good information on which development institutions like ourselves could premise lending strategies. So that's the rationale essentially for the work. Okay, that's stuck again. Okay, here we go. What the report does first is to paint sort of a backdrop for the need for PPPs. It does this in the following manner. It takes a look at certain benchmarks, indicators, using three sectors for the analysis. One, looking at the gaps in the water sector. Two, looking at gaps in relation to the cost of electricity. And thirdly, looking at gaps in relation to the transport sector. In relation to the water sector, the study makes the point that using 10 comparator countries, Botswana, Costa Rica, Fiji, Maldives, Malta, Mauritius, Palau, Seychelles, Tonga, and Uruguay as the set of comparative studies, the region was essentially lagging access to water. I think the numbers that we gave in the report was in the region, we were at the level of 95% or thereabouts. The comparative studies were in the region of 98%. In addition to that, the level of non-revenue water in the region was also seen as relatively high. And these are if you want, areas that lend themselves to the utilization of PPPs as a potential solution. In the area of our average tariff levels, as was mentioned this morning in the presidential remarks as well, the region is not doing as well as it could. The average levels reported in the report for the Caribbean was around 35 US cents per kilowatt hour compared to 21 cents for the comparator studies. So there are lags, or we're lagging in relation to cost of electricity as well as cost of doing business generally. In the area of paved roads as well, the report does in fact make the point that for the region, we were close to 50%, whereas the comparative studies were closer to 76%. So essentially, it's making a case that given the infrastructure deficits in those three sectors, that there's, as I said, a prima facie case that could be made for using PPPs in this regard. I should hasten to add that the study recognizes that there are some limitations, so we've only used those three sectors as being representative of the infrastructure gaps. Indeed, the gaps could be larger if we take on board a larger sample. The study also comes up with a magnitude of resources that it would require to fill the infrastructure gaps between the period 2015 to 2025. And there's some basic assumptions made in relation to those numbers. In relation to energy, it was found that close to $12 billion would be required to replace old capabilities and old capacity. In relation to the water sector, the working assumption was that what would it take to have access by 2015 close to 100% in the region, using Haiti as the only exception. And the working assumption there was what would be required to take Haiti to a space where it has access of close to 60% by 2025. And then in relation to transport sector, the report looks at both at airports, seaports, roads, and roads as well. And the funding gap that the report comes up with was close to $10 billion, again, over the 10-year period, 2015 to 2025. So indeed, there's some space that needs to be filled, but how do we fill that, and with what types of PPP is the burning question. In relation to some early lessons pointed out in the document, we've argued that PPPs work best and add most value under certain conditions. This is the findings of the empirical work. One, in cases where there's clear accountability and the assets are relatively discrete, so that if it's a service that will be provided in relation to a performance target, or again, if it's a road that needs to be constructed, where assets are discrete, PPPs tend to work better. So that the Sankster International Airport in Jamaica is highlighted in the report as a good case study. The report also highlights a Highway 2000 project, again in Jamaica, and we'll hear more on Highway 2000 from Ivan when he presents. But as well as using a case of Bahamas, looking at the water and sewage company, where a performance contract was looked at a couple of years ago, again, where the service was relatively discrete. And then in terms of the international experience, the report uses hospital construction in Lesotho as given us a good indicators and good indications as to what is possible if we adopt the appropriate PPP model. The report is also clear on the fact that profit potential has to be given. PPPs essentially, as we all know, employ a partnership between public and private. The interest of the private sector is driven almost 100% by the need to generate adequate returns on investment. So that we need to demonstrate that the project that is being pursued, in fact, has a very strong potential of making a profit and hence carry relatively low risk in terms of returns on assets. And the report also makes the point that if it's the case that we need to, one, explore the possibility of viability gap funding or explore the possibility of liquidity support, then what we would have to do very early in the game is to ensure that we've built in that into the budget. And I'll come to the whole issue of fiscal surprises in a second. And then lastly, the whole issue of market appetite. There's no need or it's effortless if we try to structure PPP deals where the market is not there to support such a venture. So the whole question of ensuring that we've got broad stakeholder consultation and we're certain that there's some strong interest in what we're seeking to package is fundamentally important. So I've been shown my time, so I'll be very quick here. This is not staying. It's not staying. In terms of guarding against fiscal surprises, the report notes the following. As it stands now, there are two standards. One is based on looking at Eurostat and the European System of Accounts 95, which essentially says that we need to ensure that we account for availability payments as well as viability gaps in the budget, but that the asset for PPPs essentially could stay off of the balance sheet of the public sector. The challenge to that coming from IPSAS, the International Public Sector Accounting Standard, both 32 and 19, is that we need to take fully on board the whole question of guarantees as well as the PPP itself. So there's no hiding the debt under the carpet. So one goes for full transparency and being extremely conservative. The next goes for looking to see to what extent the budget has to support the PPP effort. If you can just very briefly touch on the role for CDB going forward. We've asked in the report does in fact speak to how can CDB help the process going forward. What is clear from the report is that the whole issue of capacity in countries represent a binding constraint. To what extent could we provide a platform where good lessons coming from countries now with some capacity, a la Jamaica and so on, could be transferred to countries with less of a capacity. So we think that there's a role to provide good coordination between the two sets, if you want, of countries. In addition to that, there's a role to play for ongoing capacity development. We're talking about training, we're talking about ensuring that at least on an annual basis, we have a platform where ideas could be exchanged, experiences could be shared. We think that's a role that CDB indeed will play. And lastly, the whole issue of downstreaming and funding for PPPs themselves. The bank is currently in collaboration with a few IFIs, including IDB and IFC, to see how best we could fund such a possibility. Again, the report is very expansive. I think we're making the report available online as I speak. But perhaps I should close here and entertain some questions in the Q&A and answer. Thanks a lot for that, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carl. Okay. We will have time at the end of the presentations to entertain questions, and I'm sure Carl will be able to go into much greater detail then. Next up, I ask Mr. Richard Caballo to give us his presentation on the IFC perspective on PPPs for the Caribbean.
Good afternoon, governors of CDB, friends of CDB, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, many thanks for the invitation. We're going to share our experience and lessons in doing PPPs in Latin America and specifically in the Caribbean in the past 4 or 5 years. Our division at IFC is basically financial advisors to structured transactions. So we are not going to show the studies. We're basically showing practical lessons of our dealings with PPPs in the region. So first, the overview, nothing new here. Basically, we need to improve infrastructure to increase competitiveness, improve service delivery, and support sustainable growth. And there's an opportunity for private sector to participate. What we see in the region is significant interest from all kinds of governments in pursuing the PPP route. There are several that have well-established programs like Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Brazil. There are newcomers in Central America, countries that are issuing laws and creating PPP units, and significant interest from sponsors, especially from Europe. We see, for example, that the Colombian government has launched a very large road program that has attracted attention from investors from all over the place. And the good news is that these investors are not looking just at Latin America, but they're also asking questions about the Caribbean and other regions. Why governments are relying on PPPs? Several reasons. Obviously, the financing is one of them, but not the only one. One of the main that we have found in talking to governments is that they like the model because it's not only focused on the construction, but also on the operation, meaning it provides a solution, a long-term solution for a problem, not just a construction, which eventually, if the asset is not maintained, you will have to rebuild the asset in some years. But again, it provides a sustainable solution, again, for a problem. Second, it's not just about private sector financing, it's also about efficiency. And in fact, if there's no efficiency, then probably the PPP model is not better than public works. Because, as you may understand, private sector financing may be higher than public funding. However, the bet is that the efficiency provided by private sector overcomes the higher cost on the financing side. And in fact, several countries are still pursuing this route. Third, we're seeing that this scheme is applied not only to traditional sectors, countries that are very used to do roads, ports, airports, energy in all its forms, generation, transmission, distribution, renewables, but also social sectors. And we are seeing an opening in the region to do schools and health projects in different forms. So flexibility of this scheme is also very attractive for governments in trying to solve solutions. We also see experiments, actually quite interested, in other sectors, in what we call the new sectors. In agriculture, for example, our division has done silos or storage facilities in India for agricultural purposes. In Brazil, they are experimenting with irrigation projects. We're even handling a forest concession in the middle of the Amazon. So new sectors. In buildings, you can see stadiums in Brazil. You can see government facilities. So a lot of experimentation in this area, quite successful. However, I think that we have to be mindful that this is not the solution for everything. I think that we have to be realistic. There are certain projects that it may be worth to look at the PPP solution. Some others that may not be suitable for this. So a word of caution about that this is not, the solution for everything. So this is a partnership between public sector and private sector. So the public sector is the one who generates the initiative. It sets up the rule, the objectives of the project. It prepares the transaction, the risk allocation that is presented to the market. It is the entity who regulates the contract after this is awarded, and we're talking about probably 20 to 25 years of monitoring and supervision. And it's also the one who designs the strategy for the sector, not only for the project. And obviously have to take care about the affordability issues to protect the poor population. On the private sector side, we expect from them to bring management expertise, efficiency, and financing. Okay, so let's go to the Caribbean. What we're seeing in the Caribbean is a wide range of potential PPPs in different sectors: airports, telecoms, water, energy, renewable especially, health and education. Another opportunity is that, again, we are seeing private sector investors being attracted to emerging markets, Latin America, and therefore looking also at the Caribbean. We are handling a few transactions in the Caribbean now, and we see the same kind of investors asking for these projects that are also looking at opportunities in Latin America. Now, within this environment, well-structured projects may survive this competition, but we have to invest time and money in preparing the projects to take them to market. The challenges are, I think, well known: limited fiscal space for some PPPs in certain sectors. For example, hospitals, if the users cannot pay and the private sector has to rely on availability payments or government payments, obviously the fiscal space is an issue. Airports in which users pay the revenues to the concessionaire may not be the case, but we have to be mindful about the fiscal limitations. Second, the size. As you was mentioned, these are project finance transactions, therefore the cost could be significant. For, I would say, medium projects, our historical average in terms of consultants' costs varies between $500,000 to $800,000 per project. So it's not minor, and if you have a project of $5 million CapEx and you're going to spend $1 million in consultants, doesn't make any sense. So size is an issue. Now, we have been working with some governments, for example, Colombia, in trying to standardize transaction documents to lower transaction costs. That could be a way to handle this in the Caribbean, because its legislation is again based on common law. So I would say that the standardization of transaction documents could make sense. Management of stakeholders, more and more we see that there's more consultation about these projects. Normally these are high-profile projects and require significant consultations before you start the bidding process, which has to be very efficient to attract investors. But all consultations have to be well managed, and more we see communication experts required into this field. Funding to structure transactions, again, these are costly, so sometimes government don't have the funds to engage. Luckily, in the Caribbean, we are getting support from the Canadian government through their government commitment, meaning, for example, in my country, Peru, the PPP unit has a board of 5 ministers. These ministers meet every Thursday, every week, at 8 a.m. And this program has started in the 90s, and they still meet once a week. That's commitment. If something happens with the transaction, there's a political champion that goes to the media and defends the transaction. That is political will. So this is not a business in which you hire an advisor and assume that the advisor will carry on with the transaction. This is a business in which the government has to be very active to be successful. Stakeholders we talk about, and selecting the right project is also key. One of the main advantages of this scheme is that it is presented to the market and receives the market test. So any white elephant will not survive. Has to be a project that has economic sense and is highly needed. We talk about preparing the projects to go to market. Comprehensive due diligence is needed in all areas, technical, legal, financial, environmental, in order for the project to be solid and resist the market test. It will help you also to structure the transactions and prepare for the investors when they can, with their big due diligence team, well prepared to ask all the questions about the project. I'm almost done. Well, this is the typical element for success. Obviously, you will need regulation in place, policies, a regulator that is capable to supervise the contract after awarding, and sometimes people focus only in the bidding process and the selection of the bidder and then forget that you have 20 more years of monitoring. Institutional capacity, and as I said, communication program. This is more and more needed. In our teams, we typically hire communication, especially from the start, to deal with the stakeholders and public opinion. Bankability, just to remind people that probably 30% will come from equity and 70% from debt. So lenders have a say in this transaction, and if the transaction is not bankable, you don't have a project. And this is just commercial, so we can skip that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'll ask Jamel to now come and give us his presentation on structuring finance for Caribbean growth using PPPs.
Thank you, and thank you for having me as well. Oops. Technology challenges. Okay, I'm with CIBC, and we as a bank have infrastructure as part of our strategy for our entire group. Let me just make sure I know how to operate this thing. Oops. And it's part of our strategy. Okay, thank you. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of the things that we've seen in infrastructure. PPP, or P3 by extension, is related to infrastructure, and that's why we have an interest in that. And what we try to do as a bank is we try to bring all the stakeholders together that have an interest in this, and we run conferences, and we try to get some answers to some of the difficult questions that are facing folks out there in this area. So I'm just going to talk very, very briefly in the next 10 minutes or so about some of our experiences, give you an idea about what our infrastructure is all about, and talk about some of the early lessons, more from the banking perspective. Next slide, please. Okay. All right, I covered this already. This is who we are. As I said, we have an interest in infrastructure. It's a group strategy, and we are lenders. So the definition of infrastructure, basically, we look at it in two categories: economic infrastructure and social infrastructure. Basically, on the economic side, which are the things that are very revenue generating, the airports, the cruise ports, the type of assets that we see a lot in the Caribbean that are being developed. That's where most of the deals that we see right now are coming from. Power and utilities, obviously another major sector that we see. And then we also have we have the social infrastructure, which is the education, school boards, universities and things like that, hospitals. These are a lot more challenging, social housing and other topics like that. And the reason why these are more challenging, there's not an easily identifiable revenue stream, or what we call like the funding model for repayment. These tend to rely a little bit more on just a government payment. And with the economies that we're in now, it's a lot more difficult to finance those. So if I could go back to the previous slide, I'll just touch a bit on some of the lessons learned. Oh, okay. Oops. Let's see. Right, some of the lessons learned, or what we look for as bankers when we come to these projects. We've had, I will say we've done a few infrastructure deals. I will emphasize that not all of these were P3 or PPP, because all don't have to be structured that way. As a matter of fact, there are some of the cruise ports and airports that are quite easily done without P3. But if you're looking for efficiencies and you have a good sponsor, a good developer that is able to build this thing much more efficiently as a private sector entity than government, then that works well. But what do we typically look for? And there are a couple of categories here, and try to summarize these things. But in terms of the sponsors, now these are the persons that bring the equity or that bring the project together. We've had a lot of cases, practical cases, where we've worked to develop PPP projects in the area of ports and other infrastructure. And to be honest with you, one of the challenges that is out there is that you often get sponsors who come to the table who really don't have the financial wherewithal, and you only find that out very, very late after you've negotiated all the agreements and you've signed everything and you're about to do the deal. And, you know, the bank has got, as Richard said, the 70% or whatever the debt is, but the other part of the equity is now a challenge. And my advice on that would be to have these sponsors that come to you actually demonstrate that they can bring the remainder of the financing or the equity to the table, even if they have to bring something like a letter of credit to you, because we've had this episode, and, you know, after a year of negotiations, the deal fell apart and the government actually had to take the deal back and do it as a regular transaction. So access to capital is one of the key things that I'd want to stress for that. And also the sponsors' willingness to stand behind the project. We don't expect any sponsor will guarantee an infrastructure project of a certain size, but we believe that they can show some type of financial support in what we call the ramp-up period, which is right after the construction, when things have to get to some type of steady state. So that is very critical and important for us to have those types of guarantees and financial wherewithal. What I've seen a lot too is that a lot of the projects, and these projects are the ones I'm talking, maybe like 30 to 60 million, you have what I call a contractor rather than a developer. They really want to build something, and that's all they want to do, build this and go away. But under the PPP, as you know, it's a long-term arrangement. So they're not really interested in that, but they go through the process because that's the only way to get the project done. And that's when the problems start. So under the counterparties, now we're talking about strong off-takers. We're talking really about the funding model, like not the financing, but what is the revenue source for this and how is it going to be paid? If it's a power deal, we'll have a power purchase agreement, but how strong is the power company that is backing that? So it's okay to have a 20-year power purchase agreement, but really, how strong is that power company? Are you confident in their ability to pay that over the 20 years? So that is part of the funding model. We talk also about things like contracted cash flows, which is similar, but we also talk about things like user fees and revenues. In the case of airports and cruise ports, those are pretty clear cut in terms of head tax on passengers. You can model that. There's a certain demand risk that you can take, but it's clear. It's not just relying on the government to make a payment. It's got its alternative revenue source. And we look there for things like whether there's flexibility to increase. And all this is encoded in what we call like a project development agreement, which is critical. The other things we would be looking for in there is like what are the exit conditions or the termination conditions. If this thing is terminated, and the bank will have some type of step-in rights to go in there before it gets terminated. But if it's terminated and the sponsor or the private sector borrower is thrown out, then we have to know that we are going to be covered in a case like that. So there has to be some type of compensation mechanism. Either there's like the government is going to take it over, or there's some type of lump sum payment. So all of these things have to be negotiated very clearly up front. in any type of agreement that is structured. And that is part of the contractual framework, so that private-public partnership agreement that is negotiated has to be clear, and the risk sharing and allocation that were touched on in the previous presentations have to be clear as well. Generally, we would only expect the sponsor to be taking sort of like the construction risk, really, because we would expect them to outsource that type of risk to a solid contractor who can actually come up with the requisite bonding and sort of guarantees that can mitigate that type of risk. So there are various risks that we as a bank look at, and these would be construction, operating risks. The financing risks we ourselves can manage quite well with the various instruments that we have to do that, so we take a look at all of those things. The other stuff there, like proven technology, established operating history, those types of things are fairly obvious, and we look at those as well. And we can touch on those more in the discussion as we go on. I think I'll just jump to some of the lessons learned in our... It's not moving again. Okay, I'll just jump to some of the lessons learned from our work. One of the things that I would just say is you need to have robustness of revenues and cash flows. That's important for a project. On the social side, we are starting to find different ways to work those, like we have some experience doing social housing and different types of revenue models. One of the other things that we look at is the term of the financing. These are usually like 20 or 30-year agreements, but obviously as a bank, we're not going to go that long. We'd probably go 8 to 10 years. So there's a certain amount of refinancing risk that we can talk about and discuss in the later. We talked about the market risk and demand risk. Who's going to be bearing that? Is it the developer? Is it government? Is government going to make a payment to cover the risk if the traffic is less? The deals we are seeing on the economic infrastructure side really don't carry that, and I believe the idea is government wants to get out of that type of liability in most cases, so we don't expect to see a lot of that. So we look at the feasibility and the financial model quite closely. The financing mix, again, I would stress, this is a deal killer for a lot of things, because we as the bank, we do a lot of work and we get the deals approved, and we have the terms of the balance of the financing, which is usually in the form of equity. But what often happens is that we will see the developer coming to us with debt, and equity is supposed to be long-term patient capital, but if we're going 10 years and the supposed equity wants to be out in 7, we know that there's a problem there, and the rate suggests too high for the type of projects we have in the region to be able to support. 15% or more type of return. So those are things that really challenge these projects from a banking perspective, and we definitely need to ensure that when we select, when we're doing the due diligence on these developers and all the projects as we go through, that up front we make certain that they can deliver or that they have the cash to put in. We do have some projects now which we're doing which are funded by cash equity. That always works very well. Or we can have a letter of credit which demonstrates that they have the money to come once the bank is able to bring their 70% to the table. I'm going to leave it there so we can have more discussion about risk, because I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions in that area. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jamal, for an interesting presentation. Next up is Mr. Ivan Anderson, and he will present to us a case study from Jamaica on Highway 2000.
Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. And let me thank the CDB for the opportunity to listen to some of the lessons that we have learned over the past 15 years. My apologies again, I know what it's like a half hour after lunch, so I'll try not to be too long. The Highway 2000 project was envisaged to be a 230-kilometer highway project connecting the south coast of Jamaica to the north coast of Jamaica. It was intended to be implemented in 2 phases. Phase 1 to be implemented from Kingston to Maypen, followed by phase 2 from Kingston to Ocho Rios, and then a final phase going all the way into Montego Bay. And for those of you who know Jamaica, this is intended to connect the north coast of Jamaica to the south coast of Jamaica, and also to connect the largest cities in Jamaica, Montego Bay in the western end of the island, to Kingston in the eastern end of the island. Maybe one of the initial lessons that we learned very quickly, we assumed that we could have done a 230-kilometer project, a $1 billion project at one go. I think very quickly we learned after discussing with having the first initial roadshows with the developer, Jamaica didn't have a track record of doing PPPs. We didn't even have legislation to support toll roads. And therefore the business of doing such a large project was not on the table. So what we did, we split the project, and the developer got options. He was required to do phase 1A of the project, phase 1A and phase 1B of the project, and he got an option to do phase 1C, and then a right of first refusal to do the remainder of the highway project. So, as I indicated, this project was a part of the infrastructure development plan for Jamaica. And the objectives of the project were far more than just getting a highway from Kingston to Montego Bay and from the south coast to the north coast. The project was envisaged to be able to serve as a catalyst for economic activity. It was envisaged to, as I said, connect these large centers of the country together and therefore improve the whole economic development of the country, reduce unemployment, reduce vehicle operating costs, and in fact, we had expected that in the long term, the project could have generated as much as 100,000 jobs in the long term, and as much as 3% GDP growth on top of the economy. So the goals of the project were huge. And what we'll talk about now is what happened along the way, and maybe some of the things that we did right, and some of the things that we didn't do so correctly. The structure of the project is typical. NROC, which is where we sit, we have a concession agreement with the concessionaire, Trans-Jamaica Highway. And they had employed Bouygues Travaux Publics. Bouygues is one of the largest contractors in the world to implement the project. And then there are all the other parties to the project. The financing structure for the concession number 1 was a 35-year concession. And that concession envisaged that the government of Jamaica would have provided approximately 30% of the financing for the project through what we call subordinated loans. They were subordinated to the senior lender, and in fact they were almost on par with equity. The developer, on the other hand, raised approximately $198 million of loan and approximately $27 million of equity funding for the project. And in fact, this is the refinancing of the project that took place in 2011. Initially, the project was financed. We were not able to attract the multilaterals to the project in the early stages of the concession agreement. And in fact, initially the project was financed through a loan through RBTT. That was then taken over in 2011 by a consortium of bilaterals and multilaterals, IDB, IFC, EIB, and Proparco. In fact, IFC, thanks to Richard, also took some amount of equity in the project at that stage. So the project was refinanced in 2011, and this is what the structure of the project looked like in 2011. So this is a 35-year concession with traditional multilateral funders. Concession number 2, you could say we learned some lessons from concession number 1, and we'll talk more about some of those lessons, is a $600 million project now. And this is the north-south leg of that project. So originally we had all the project in one concession. But the original concessionaire didn't take up phase 2 of the project. So we went to concession number 2. And concession number 2 is a $600 million project going from south to north. In that project, the developer himself will provide, or has provided, about 24% of the equity, 24% of the project financing, a total of about $144 million. And another $450 million is being provided by China Development Bank as loan financing for the project. So whereas in the initial project, the government of Jamaica, through NROC, unlent to the developer about $99 million, in concession number 2, NROC provides no financing at all for the project. What we did, however, was we provided certain other incentives. We provided lands, approximately 1,200 acres of lands for the developer. These lands to be developed after the highway was developed. And these lands not able to be sold until they were also developed. So we structured the project slightly differently. In the first project, we provided financing subordinated to the senior lenders. In the second project, we provided lands to the developer for further development to increase the traffic on the highway itself. The risk sharing, in the initial project, the developer took traffic risk, he took revenue risk, he took what we call foreseeable design and construction risk, and the government of Jamaica took the other risk. In concession number 2, the developer again took the traffic risk, he again took revenue risk, but here we made some changes. Government of Jamaica didn't take any design or foreseeability issues in terms of design risk. Those full risks were passed to the developer. In terms of standby equity, subordinated capital, again, those risks were passed to the developer. In the original project, Government of Jamaica subordinated loans. In the second project, no loans at all to the developer. We also didn't take termination risks, and we'll talk a little bit about termination risk and how we handle them. In the original project, if the project failed for whatever reason, whether it was default of the developer, default of the authority of NROC, or no fault termination, the government of Jamaica still had a responsibility to repay the loans which were outstanding at the time. A default by the developer would have lost his equity, but the government of Jamaica would still be obligated to repay the loans. In concession number 2, all of that was transferred to the developer, and I'll talk a minute about how we dealt with the termination risk issues and how those are transferred to the developer. One of these is an unsolicited proposal. Maybe at the end you can tell me which one of them it is. In terms of traffic, just to give you an indication what the tolls are, the tolls on the existing 50 kilometers that are in operation are approximately 9 cents per kilometer now. In terms of traffic, since about 2008, traffic on the highway has stalled. Predicting traffic and revenue growth is an almost impossible science. Predicting traffic and revenue growth in an environment where a country is contracting is impossible. And so these are some of the issues that we'll talk about in terms of some of the lessons that we have learned. Richard talked about some of the lessons in terms of having a political champion, having strong political will associated with the project. But maybe the first and most important thing is, as Richard has pointed out already, start with a good project. It doesn't make sense to have a laundry list of projects which you have very little knowledge of. If you don't understand the risks of your project, then it's very likely that any potential developer who is sitting in front of you will also have the same kind of challenges. Good and dedicated team of advisors who prepare the RFP. When we went on our roadshows early in 1999 to talk to potential developers about the project, many times the developers would just look at who our advisors were to determine whether the project was worth bidding on. The more confidence that they had in the advisors, is the greater the likelihood that they would bid on the project. The project, as conceived, as we indicated earlier, may not be bankable as currently structured. And so it's important that you be flexible in how the project is designed and be prepared to modify the project. Support from the public sector may also be required. There are very few projects that are going to stand on their own, especially in a Caribbean environment, where the full project costs can be supported solely by the revenues from the project. Some of the risks, as we talked about, which are typical for the developer, include the technical risk, the design risk, the construction risk, the traffic risk, revenue risk, etc. But as I said earlier, one of the most important areas that you can look at when you look at a concession agreement is the question of the termination risks. What happens when the project is terminated? What happens when the developer is at fault? Whose liability are the loans? In the case of our second project, what we did was we proposed a tendering procedure. And this is probably similar to what in the PF2 form of contract is now being proposed. If there's a termination by the developer, then you go back to tender. And whatever you get from that tender sum then goes to repay the loans of the developer. And similarly, where there's a no-fault termination, we have a similar mechanism for resolving that issue. No-fault termination, go back to tender, and we go to tender as many times as the financiers require until we get sufficient funds to pay out the loans. Finally, just to comment, you get what you negotiate. There's going to be a lot of negotiation taking place in finalizing the terms of the concession agreement. It's important that the people who are sitting on your side of the table fully understand the risks associated with the project. Because there's no doubt that the people on the other side of the table will understand those risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Very useful presentation. Up next, we've got Mr. Winston Brasington, Chief Executive Officer of Guyana Holding Company for Investments.
Good afternoon, everyone. A pleasure to be here. Okay. The title of my presentation is a bit broader than the hydro. In fact, I'm going to look at a couple of PPPs in Guyana. Jumping right into the presentation. Maybe I need to move that manually. Okay. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to give a brief introduction, speak to three projects that we're doing in the PPP context. One we've already completed, the Berbice Bridge. One is ongoing, the Marriott Hotel project. And one we plan to start by the end of this year. I'll then quickly look at these lessons learned and what are the opportunities and challenges. It's working. Okay. And then finally speak to projects in the pipeline. Very quickly, Guyana has had a significant privatization program in the last 20 plus years. And about 10 years ago, we moved to the next phase of privatization, PPPs, starting with the Berbice Bridge. We recognize that the concession-type model could be a useful mechanism to fund infrastructure without incurring the fiscal risk of domestic public debt. We also recognize that the stable macroeconomy, supported with high liquidity, low deposit rates, declining lending rates, supported this trust of moving to concession-type financing using domestic private money. And finally, we knew that we had learned quite a lot from our privatization experience, and our familiarity with these transactions would help us in moving to the next phase in pursuing PPPs. With that brief introduction, I go to our first project, the Berbice Bridge. This is a 1.55 kilometer bridge, floating bridge, over the Berbice River that replaced the ferry service. The bridge basically has a retractor span that opens for large ships and a high span that allows small ships and barges to cross under. Opens once a day. The financing structure. This project, about 41 million. All of the financing was denominated in Guyana dollars, and all of it, almost all of it, was raised from our local financial intermediaries. It's a highly leveraged transaction in that in order to reduce the cost of capital, we reduced the level of equity and focused more on different classes of debt. But we didn't do too bad. In 2006, when we achieved financial closure in this project, we were able to achieve financing costs below the prime lending rate. Our first tranche of bonds was 9% fixed in Guyana dollars. Our second tranche of bonds, 10%, and our loan stock and preferred shares were 11%. Our weighted average cost of capital was a little over 10%. And all of these instruments were long-term instruments with a principal moratorium of 8 years and a repayment schedule that varied between 8 and 20 years. In fact, starting this year, the principal of the first tranche of bonds will start to be repaid. This is the project structure, traditional project structure. In the center is the Berbice Bridge Company, a special purpose company. On the top are the providers, the equity providers and the debt providers, and all of the related security documentation. So you have shareholder agreements, you have trust deeds and debentures and various forms of guarantees from the providers of capital. On the right is the government of Guyana, who issued a concession agreement. This concession agreement was issued pursuant to a special piece of legislation, the Berbice Bridge Act, which was passed in Parliament, and the powers under that act provided for the issuance of a concession agreement. The government on the public side also agreed with funding from the IDB to build the access roads to the bridge. The project was built using an EPC contractor, a design-build contract, an international firm, Bosch Rexroth, Mabey and Johnson, and they won an international tender to build the bridge, and they were supervised by an independent firm. So basically, this was the project structure of local financing, international contractors, a turnkey type contract, a concession agreement from the government, and the government pitching in to build the roads. At this point, The government has no investment in the bridge save and except for the National Insurance Scheme. Now, the project benefits for this project were significant. Essentially, the project allowed traffic over the Berbice River, which generally took 3 hours with waiting time, to go from 3 hours to 3 minutes. And it was achieved at materially the same toll level as that which existed on the ferry in 2005. The financing was broad-based from the financial institutions. Apart from the shareholders, we had the top 5 banks in the country, most of the pension funds, most of the insurance companies, the NIS and the NBS all participating in the financing, and there were no government guarantees. The project was structured so that the concession agreement provided for a toll formula where annual tolls could be adjusted so as to ensure sufficient revenue to cover operating and maintenance costs and servicing of capital. The length of the concession, starting from financial close, was 21 years. The bridge was opened in December 2008. Now, having completed the bridge, what is always important is the revenue projections. I think the previous speaker spoke about revenue projections. We were moving from a ferry to a bridge. We had a feasibility study completed by Louis Berger. We had a willingness to pay study. We had the existing volumes on the ferry and the existing ferry toll levels. And we used these to basically craft what would be the projected toll levels on the bridge and what the expected traffic volumes could be, resulting in our revenue. Now, how did we do? Now, this shows what the toll level on the ferry was relative to the bridge. We've had to make certain adjustments. On the ferry, you paid both for the vehicle each way and for each passenger in the vehicle. On the bridge, you pay a round-trip fare, which includes all the passengers. But materially, given that cars and minibuses make up 95% of the passenger revenue, materially, the tolls on the bridge were materially similar to what we had on the ferry. And we have not had any changes in the tolls since the bridge opened in 2008. And when we looked at the comparison to 2005, this is almost 10 years with no changes. In real terms, inflation has been 67%. So what people are paying today on the bridge is substantially less in real terms than what they were paying on the ferry in 2005. Now, how did we do in terms of And so when we look at the revenue performance, we've done slightly better than projected. We've seen a steady growth in both passenger vehicles and commercial vehicles revenue each year. And I think by this measure, the bridge has been so far a success. All of the financing is being paid, except for the common shareholders. I now go to the next project, a project currently under construction, the Marriott Hotel and Entertainment Complex. We've not had a new branded hotel of international level in over 40 years. The last major brand that came to Guyana was the Pegasus. The Pegasus left in 2008. And so having a well-recognized international branded hotel was important on many fronts, including tourism, being able to attract the business traveler, and so on. And so this project is being developed using a public-private partnership model where the government, through its investment company, is putting 1/3 of the money. On your screen is a rendering of the project. It's located near to the Pegasus, right on the corner of the river and the ocean, on about 8 acres of land. This is what it looks like as of last week. We're targeting an opening before the end of the year. This is an aerial view. Now, the project is a substantial project, 197 rooms, and a separately operated entertainment complex that will contain a casino, a nightclub, and a restaurant. The feasibility study for the project was completed by HPS International and has an overall internal rate of return of 11%. This is the project structure. Similar project structure. In the center is a special purpose company. On the top, the equity providers, Hong Kong Investment Group, and the government holding company. On the bottom, the providers of debt. Senior debt has been syndicated through Republic Bank. The operator is also providing debt for the entertainment complex outfitting, and the government is providing subordinate debt. On the right-hand side, the various operator agreements, the major ones being with Marriott. And then the government has provided various tax incentives, and of course the project has an environmental permit. On the left, the construction, internationally bid contractor who has a design-build contract, more or less a turnkey contract, with supervision. So this is the project structure. Now the size of this project is about 50% larger than the Burbage Bridge. We're looking at about 60 million US, a little under 60. And again, we have a high level of debt at various levels, and equity of 12 million, debt of 46 million. Almost all of the financing is hard cost. Moving on to the next project, the Amila Falls Hydro Project. This is a $860 million project. It's one of our transformational projects. It will allow Guyana in one step to go from being almost entirely supplied with thermal energy to being almost entirely supplied with renewable energy. We're going to have a 20-year boot where at the end of 20 years after construction, the project will revert to the state at no cost. The economic benefits, the financial benefits from this is significant. Currently, our generation cost using fossil fuels is about 19 US cents a kilowatt hour. Our tariffs is about 31 cents. With the Amila Falls, we'll be able to obtain generation from the hydro between 10 and 11 US cents a kilowatt hour. In annual dollar terms, the energy that we will get from the hydro will allow us to substitute away $200 million US in fuel payments in exchange for paying a little over $100 million a year. Net savings of close to $100 million. This project could be a model on climate financing and basically moving away from thermal energy to renewable energy. And it's our flagship project under the LCDS. Now, what's the scope of the project? Basically, it's a 165 megawatt hydro project. It's a 270-kilometer transmission line and 2 substations. And its access roads totaling a little over 200 kilometers, of which 85 kilometers are new access roads built into the forest, all done to the highest level of environmental standards. This is the route. The project is actually located very close to Kaito Falls. Now, the project structure. Okay, let me do this. 1, 2, stay, good. All right, the project structure. We have, again, a special purpose company. At the bottom are the debt providers, the China Development Bank, the major debt provider, and the IDB. The IDB has been a key party to the transaction. On the top is our current sponsor, Site Global. They withdrew, but we're still talking, and it's our expectation that if they don't proceed with the project, that the Chinese are willing to become the sponsor. And the decision on that will be known shortly. To build the project on the left is the EPC contractor. There's already an inked EPC contract with China Railway First Group, and they will build the project on a turnkey basis. The funding, apart from the sponsor, will include some money from the government, including the access road construction, and 80 million from the Norwegian fund, the LCDS project. Once the project is built, all of the power will be delivered under a power purchase agreement to the state-owned power company, GPL, which will have a PPA, and payments will be secured through a receivables agreement administered by our largest bank in the country. Now the cost, 860 million, 70% debt, 30% equity. A large portion of the financing goes into the EPC cost, but because of the long lead time to get to the project start, and because of the long construction period time, a little under 4 years, you have significantly other development costs and soft costs, including interest during construction. So the cost here covers you all the way up to completion of the project or commercial operations. Now, in wrapping up, opportunities and challenges. So we do have some experience with PPP projects. And like other countries, we're now looking to implement this in a formal structure by having a white paper on PPPs. We already have a white paper on privatization. The major thrust of the PPPs will be on infrastructure. In Guyana, reducing logistical costs, improving efficiencies, opening up new frontiers are all of the expected benefits from infrastructure development. And our stable macroeconomy lends itself well for these developments. But we are not without challenges. Political consensus has been difficult. We also recognize in order to do these projects well, it takes substantial project preparation, time, cost, and skills. And as we get into the larger projects, our domestic financing will be limited and we'll become more reliant on international financing. And we've seen that most of this has been coming from China in recent years. I think this is a regional trend too. In closing, we've got about 10 years of experience with PPPs. Overall positive, but difficult to find political consensus. A defined framework, a structured framework for PPPs is being worked on. And we have quite a number of other projects in the pipeline. The new Demerara Bridge to replace the floating bridge built in the 1970s, dredging the Demerara River Harbor, a deep water port, paving the road to Brazil, and developing in the upper Mazaruni a large hydro project, primarily geared to supply Brazil with power. So these are some of the projects in the pipelines. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you very much, Winston, for a very informative presentation. I'll now like to open the floor for any questions that delegates and guests might have for the panelists. Jamaica.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I note with interest the presentations, and I want to congratulate all the presenters for the information that was provided. But I did think I saw a potential conundrum that the countries of the Caribbean are, on average, faced with a very high debt level and are engaging in various forms of fiscal consolidation efforts at this point. I note that Ipsos 92 indicates that we should make provision for the liability. So we're making provision for the liability while at the same time having very large debt levels, which in and of itself creates a difficulty with fiscal space and elimination of the fiscal deficit. I needed a little clarification on that. At the same time, I also noticed that with PPPs, whereas the rewards are likely to go to the private sector, the risks are being borne by government, whereas we should be structuring it in such a way that the risks are adequately borne by those who receive that reward. So I reflected on the case of Jamaica, and in Jamaica we have looked at Ipsos 32 and Ipsos 19, and we will only recognize the debt when it becomes probable on our debt stock. And we have also sought to limit the extent of our PPPs to a particular level of GDP, which does not create a difficulty for overall debt reduction path. But since these activities are going to be pursuing public goods, it is very difficult for the government to step aside from these projects, particularly where there are subordinated debts and obligations on the part of government. I'm not sure it's a question. It's a concern. But it is a concern that raises a conundrum in my mind that I cannot resolve sitting here just now. I wanted to move on also to recognize Guyana's circumstances, that Guyana had a stable macroeconomic environment which lent itself to further capabilities or capacities to undertake some of these investments. And that was, in fact, a lesson for me here, sitting here, in terms of maybe recognizing that timing of these PPPs is also very critical. Finally, and this is because I'm a very simple man who doesn't speak very much, I wanted to inquire whether or not there is a cost to be borne for those engaging in PPPs, because it would appear that in the case of Jamaica, and indeed the case of Guyana, that the more you do PPPs, the better you get at it. Because it would appear that in the case of Jamaica, we had experienced some very costly lessons. But in the case of Guyana, because they had the privatization experience, they were able to benefit and so structure their PPPs in a way that allowed them to benefit significantly. Their privatization experience allowed them to benefit from the structuring of their PPPs going forward. And there are still a few more conundrums in my mind, Chair, but I will stop right here.
Thank you. I'll take, before I ask the panelists to respond, I'll take comments from Guyana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mine is more an observation than a question. I remain convinced, as I said earlier this morning, that the public-private partnership model is an extremely important instrument for use in financing the huge infrastructure gap that we have in our region. I don't see us as having too many alternatives to private capital, given the existence of this huge infrastructure gap at the same time that we face the very severe fiscal circumstances as we face. I really don't see us having too many options. The dilemma for us is that in each of our respective countries, we have, largely because of scale, fairly limited institutional capacity to implement good, large PPPs. We are fortunate that, like my colleague from Jamaica so graciously acknowledged, we are fortunate that we have some amount of capacity, but I wouldn't pretend that we have, the level of capacity that we would like to have to implement all of the PPPs that we would like to implement. But we have had a little bit of a head start, and Mr. Brassington heads a very capable unit. But the challenge for us as a region lies in identifying good opportunities for PPPs, structuring good transactions, and bringing credible investors to those transactions and bringing those transactions to conclusion. And I believe that there's still a fair distance to be traveled by the region in taking the leap to even thinking of some investments as PPP investments. Many of us still think of airports and roads and bridges as public sector investments. And I don't think we're quite at the point where we have concluded that an airport really is a ripe opportunity for PPP. And so I believe there's a very important role, given the lack of experience in the region in implementing PPPs, the urgency with which, or the legitimacy of this instrument as a solution. I believe there's a very important role to be played by our development partners, particularly the regional and international institutions, in helping us to identify good opportunities for PPPs and in helping us to conclude those transactions. And I will repeat an observation that I have made elsewhere. I believe I made it at another meeting similar to this. It wasn't a CDB event. I think it might have been an IDB event. The comment didn't necessarily reflect on the IDB, but I said at the time that all too often we get the impression that the multilateral institutions and perhaps some regional institutions too see themselves more as our guardians and protectors from bad PPP projects, and less as promoters and facilitators of good PPP projects. And so I would want to use this opportunity to call on our institutional partners. The IFC is here. The IFC has phenomenal expertise. The IDB is here, even if not around this table. The CDB, of course, is here. I would like to call on these institutions to scale up their efforts with respect to helping us to facilitate good PPP transactions. I've seen many presentations that, not necessarily these were excellent presentations because we saw real-life examples, but I've seen many presentations and read many papers that caution me on the risks. I know what the risks are. I need good transactions to be done. I need good feasibility studies to be produced. I need credible investors to be brought to the table, and I need strong agreements to be negotiated and concluded. And I need help with those. And the I here is the big I rather than the small I. And so that's the call that I would make, that there's an important role to be played by the institutions in that respect.
Thank you very much, Minister Singh. What I'd like to ask the panel to respond to some of the questions first raised by our governor from Jamaica. Can I ask you, Mark, to tackle perhaps the whole idea of how we make provisions for the liabilities associated with PPPs? Next up, I think I might ask Ivan to speak to the whole idea around the rewards of PPPs perhaps going to the private sector, and perhaps the whole idea that PPPs may be socializing the losses as it were. And then once we have those responses, I'll then ask the other panelists to respond to some of the other questions.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to my colleague from Jamaica. The treatment of PPPs in the fiscal accounts currently represent pretty much a gray area. And from all of my research so far, it tells me that there are sort of two extremes. One, we could look at the European System of Accounts 95, Eurostat sort of approach, and only record the availability payments if necessary, or viability gap support. Or if it is the case that the risks are real, then it calls you or requires you to account for those. So that's less of a conservative approach. The fund has pushed back on that. The fund is saying, look, given the fiscal situation in countries in the Caribbean, one has to adopt a far more conservative approach, and using IPSAS 32 and IPSAS 19, which says that to the extent that PPPs represent ultimately perhaps a call on the public purse, depending on how the deal is structured, then you should in fact record those risks. So we're poles apart. At a conversation in Trinidad next week at Jamal's conference, this is essentially the topic of discussion as well. How should the region go about treating with PPPs in fiscal accounts? I would argue it really depends on how well risks are managed. To the extent that you've got a deal where you've hedged against most of your risks, then perhaps one could adopt, the most appropriate approach in that regard. But I would not want to put out there that you should not account for it fiscally, because as in the past, in some countries, there have been adverse fiscal surprises, and really you do not want that. Chair, that would be my spin.
Mark, do you want to add anything to that on the liability front?
Yeah, well, this is an ongoing discussion, as was mentioned. I would say that there is still some additional room for discussion on the accounting issues. For example, the availability payment may have two components. One is the reimbursement for the investment, for the construction, and the other is the payment of the operating expenses, the year operating expenses, and probably treatment of the two could be different. Because if there's termination, obviously you will have to repay the remaining monies owed to the investment cost. But the operating expenses stop at the moment of termination. Obviously, you will have to include that in your own budget if you have to take control of the concession. But I would say that the treatment could be different. What we have seen is, yes, the fund will be very conservative. I think that the World Bank at some point was also engaging with the fund in discussions on this issue because it prevails countries going into this route in an efficient manner. What we've heard is, and we have a big discussion in the Colombian case, for example, with the fund. The first rule is transparency. What they want is government to be very open in what they are taking as availability payments and be transparent with the market. And the second is the discussion on recording. But I think that it's still room to discuss. This is not a close issue. And probably the multilaterals can help also in these discussions, not only the countries.
Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah. Go ahead. Trinidad and Tobago.
I must say, the presentations were very enlightening, and but they raise, in my mind, a number of questions. There are big questions and small questions. The small questions have to do with things like the impact, the political impact of the procurement process, the value for money issues during and on completion of projects, and the question of whether something like tolls really makes sense as part of a financing mechanism for, let's say, a road or some kind of project or service used by the population, when at the end of the day, with the state repaying after the private sector has financed, it is the taxpayers' money anyway. Okay, so I hold those as the small questions. But the big question, I have two big questions. One is that, I mean, a lot of us here are concerned about the fact that Caribbean integration has not gone the way that we had hoped. And it doesn't seem to be gelling in the way that we would like in a world that is evolving in a certain way. And the issue of projects and its ability to support the integration process and the competitive capacity in the world system is an important consideration. Yet when you look at projects on a country-by-country basis in terms of development, you miss that opportunity altogether. And it is not taken into account in the public-private sector financing of projects. And the second big issue for me is that once you have big projects, given the capacities of the region, it is very likely that you're going to have international financing and international players in the project development process. And therefore, where's the development opportunity in terms of local capacity for the private sector? So those are my considerations.
Richard.
If I may, I think that the first issue, value for money and the use of taxpayer money for this kind of schemes. Listen, PPP is not a science. Yeah? It could go very bad if it's not well structured. Good news is there's already 20 years of experience in just Latin America about how to do this transaction. So when you say, yes, you have the responsibility of tax money into paying the private sector, well, private sector has to comply with a lot of things in the contract, and they have to put guarantees for that completion. For example, you will have a performance bond, which could be executed if the private sector concessionaire doesn't comply. And this is not a letter, this is a bank guarantee. That is, it hurts, it hurts. So, yes, I would say there are stories about bad transactions in the marketplace, but I always say that for any bad transaction, I can tell you a good story too. And this goes also to the issue of governments that have engaged in PPPs and remain in that route have perfected the skills and the transactions. I have to refer again to Colombia. Colombia right now is in what they call the fourth generation of roads. The first generation was in the 90s, and they provided government guarantees. Bad lesson. They have perfected this during the years, and right now there are no guarantees anymore. So it's a skill that you have to adapt to your own environment, and yes, it can be perfected. And please, if you're going to engage for the first time, hire advisors. I mean, this is not IFC, but I mean, there's plenty of advisors in the marketplace. Invest money in having the best guys on your side, because on the other side, believe me, these guys are really experts. These are guys that will come to your country and have the expertise of negotiating these deals all over the place. So you have to prepare yourselves for the same kind of, to be at the same level in the negotiations. Integration. I have to be very open. This is a candid conversation, right? So integration. Whenever somebody comes to me with a PP project that involves two countries, I said, red flag. Why? Because experiences, and there have been several in Latin America, in Central America, for example, transmission lines. Yeah, it sounds good. Yeah, a regional market makes sense. Okay, put together 5 countries to get an agreement on how this is going to be regulated. 2 countries, my country, Peru and Ecuador, just to get an agreement on how the market is going to work with a simple transmission line. Took years. So, and this comes to political will, right? If there is enough political will and champions at the regional level to make this happen, probably it may happen. But you're right. I mean, right now, to think about regional projects that make total sense, it starts with political will and leadership. Otherwise, I don't see this happening, to be honest. Big projects and the local capacity. Well, I've heard once a friend of mine who's the South African, is the head of the South African Road Agency. And he said, to be in the public sector is to have the ability to structure transactions. So what is the government objective here? I want transfer of knowledge. An example, and this was a discussion also in some other countries. I want the local construction companies to get capacity. Do you think that if a French company, construction company, wins a road, it's going to bring French workers to your country? No. They need to team up. So I think that in the bidding rules, you can require certain conditions. Like, for example, I need to see local investors in the consortium for a minimum of, let's start slow, not very aggressive, let's say 20% or 15%, but I need to see local people in the consortium. I need you to hire, let's say your road goes in touches several communities. I need to see a social program of hiring people in the communities to the construction of the road. All those conditions, if they are sensible, I think that can be imposed in the structuring of the transaction. But again, things that make business sense. I mean, if it doesn't, then I would say the private sector will shy away from the project.
Just one comment to add to what Richard said about building capacity. What we have done in our most recent project is we've set some caps in terms of how the labor force will be structured, what composition of the labor force will be Jamaican as against what component will be Chinese. The French may not come to Jamaica to build a total project, but it's very possible to have a few thousand Chinese come to Jamaica to build a highway project. So as part of the project, we've set these caps in place, which we monitor on an ongoing basis, which establishes the limits in terms of the ratios between Jamaicans on the site as against number of expatriates on the site. We've also built into the concession a deliberate strategy of training, where the developer is required to carry out a certain number of training programs for all levels of workers, not just on the site, but across the board. In another project, which the governor from Jamaica is familiar with, we've also set caps in terms of how much work is going to be done by that overseas contractor as against how much work is going to be done by the local contractors, how much work must be subcontracted to local contractors. So those are the mechanisms that we're currently working with in terms of trying to build capacity in the local sector.
Okay, thank you, Ivan. Winston, there was a question. I'm just wondering if you can just tackle how important is having a stable macroeconomic environment for PPPs? This was a question that was raised earlier, and we didn't manage to get a response on that. And perhaps how important as well is political consensus for successful PPP projects, particularly as it relates to procurement.
Excuse me? Yeah. May I just make two general comments? First of all, I would like to thank the speakers this afternoon for the very detailed and informative presentations regarding the PPP. I have some general comments regarding how to promote the PPP so as to promote the social and economic development in the region better. Number one, because we think that now is the right time for the bank, for the CDB, to take some measures to strengthen the support to the development of the private sector in the region. Why we should see that? Because in the past, the CDB paid little attention to the private sector activities, largely due to difficulty in managing credit of this sector. This has a lot to do with the CDB's long-standing conservative lending policy, but it's due to the lack of sufficient reform motivation. However, over the past few years, especially recently, the private sector plays a leading role in investment, trade, innovation, and infrastructure development. As the private sector has become an important drive for sustainable growth and employment creation of the region, it is our view that the CDB, the most important development institution in this region, should take into consideration of its status and mandate and strengthen support to the development of the private sector. The second comment is that how should we promote the private sector operation in this region? It is our view that the CDB maybe could consider the following measures. First, in its organizational structure, a department specialized in private sector operation could be considered to be created. The bank, number two, second, the bank can assign a certain quota of ordinary loans to support the private sector development. Third, private sectors of all borrowing members are entitled to use the CDB's ordinary loans. Fourth, the bank can link the sovereign loans with the private sector loans so as to secure principal and interest payment. In this way, it should encourage the private sector's participation in CDB's projects. Additionally, the CDB could consider helping members coordinate the private sector policies and formulate private sector development strategy of its own. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you very much, Governor, from China. We'll get responses to your comments soon. But Winston, I had asked you if you could you respond to those questions that I asked?
I think the first question is a lot easier than the second question, macro versus political. I think a stable macro economy is extremely important. Infrastructure projects by nature are long-term projects. So you're typically looking at borrowing periods that are up to, well, take the Burbage Bridge. We are borrowing money for 20-year terms. There are no government guarantees. They're taking all of the risk in the project. The instruments are denominated in Guyana dollars, and the biggest percentage of your revenue is going to service debt. And so getting the lowest cost of financing is extremely important. Without having a stable macro environment, the outlook for interest rates, for inflation, would not be conducive to these sort of transactions. We've been fortunate that we have a high level of liquidity in our banking sector. Our deposit rates are close to 2%. Our treasury bill rate is around that level. And the substitution effect of where financial intermediaries can take their money and put it is either cheap government paper, which is based on a stable macroeconomy, or more attractive returns with private projects. But still achieving a long-term interest rate in the local currency tends to be very difficult and would be impossible without a stable macro environment. Even if you took your borrowings in US dollars, there is still the risk, because whilst you're paying in US dollars, typically your income is denominated in your local currency. So inflation risk, the risk that if you have an exchange rate movement, you may not be able to pass on price movements. Those sort of risk investors would be very leery with. So I think that we've been very fortunate in Guyana to have a stable macroeconomy, interest rates heading downwards, low deposit rates, our liquidity in our banking sector. We've got over $1 billion US equivalent not lent out, but we've got about 40% of our bank assets lent out. And we've been seeing double-digit growth in both deposits and assets of the banking sector, but yet we've had very stable inflation. And I think the fiscal position has been very good in that we have learned from our experiences. There's a great deal of attention to keeping fiscal deficits low, keeping debt low, and I think that has helped to keep a very low level of interest rates. And I say this, and the chairman of the privatization board and the chairman of NISL is the Minister of Finance, and we know this like ABC of what the state will not contract. The state will not increase fiscal risk if it can avoid that. Now, when it comes to political consensus on the procurement, it's a lot more complicated. Let us just say that in some of our recent projects, we've had, and many of these projects are major transformative projects, we have had difficulty getting political consensus. And it may not be based on the technical merits of the project. It may have to do more with other things. And so that is a question that is very tricky, probably one that I'm not best qualified to answer.
There was actually a question raised about the mix between international financing and, of course, domestic development. Jamel, I'm wondering if I could ask you to say a few words about that. How could we actually get domestic financing to also play a key role in PPPs?
Well, domestic financing, and that will be the form of financing that we as the regional banks can provide, is available. But as I said in the earlier presentation, there's a whole financing mix that needs to be taken into consideration. For different types of projects, it comes into structuring. Richard is here, and we would work with IFC and IADB as part of the financing mix on certain projects. The ones that we can do as a standalone, I would say, are the ones which look like the airports and the ports that are easier to model, and the revenues and they are easier to identify. When it comes to larger deals where there's more risk than a commercial bank itself would take, we have to bring in the international partners. Either they will come in with direct loans, or they can come in with a form of guarantees that will support the local banks, or the regional banks, I should say, in being able to provide the financing that is there. I took all the other comments on board as well that were coming, and I think one of the things that comes out from all the comments that were there, including the cost to be borne and the different roles, I think it's all about institutional capacity development and being able to have in each country PPP or some sort of support mechanism regionally for PPP, so that all the governments here represented will be able to structure their projects properly. I think the cost to be borne come when you don't have that capacity and you have what often comes as the unsolicited bid, and therefore you basically take what you get. So that is the risk. But my understanding is that CDB is doing some work in that area and around the institutional and capacity building for these things. And I believe that will go a long way to addressing a lot of the comments that were made earlier about the costs, about the ability to structure these projects as well. So I'll just add that.
Okay. I'm being told that we need to wrap up. I'll probably just take one more comment from the floor.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Samuel. I'm with Castalia, and we did a lot of work it was our pleasure to do a lot of the work for CDB on this research. I just wrote down just a couple of points. I'm going to take 2 minutes because I see everybody's falling asleep. Contingent liabilities. It's the IMF. What is wrong with the IMF? The IMF takes a very, very hard view. The IMF says that the government is the lender, investor, operator of last resort. So even though, Ivan, you might say that the government has no liabilities, the IMF says, yes, you do. And I think that we have a duty to make our voice heard if we differ in our opinions with the IMF. My favorite singer, George Harrison of the Beatles, made a famous line: with every mistake we must surely be learning. in which case we in the Caribbean must be very, very wise. Because we are making mistakes, but we do learn and we're getting there. But there are just a couple of things I want to say. The governments frequently want to invest in hard assets, ports, roads, railways, and so on, but they don't want to invest in the soft assets that you need to spend that make the hard assets stay hard. So you have people rushing in to do projects without the due diligence and the preparation, and that's when mistakes are made. And I'm not calling any names, I'm just saying that there are many, many mistakes that we should learn every time that we do this so that we don't do it again. NROC, interesting point. Your first road was with the French. What is it that the Chinese see that the French don't see? Why the Chinese go where the French dare not go? And this is an instructive point, because you say you got a better deal out of the French, out of the second deal, and yet, you know, the Chinese are there and the French just said no. So it's obviously a greater acceptance of risk on the part of the Chinese and the French. I say no more on that point. CDB, welcome to the world of PPPs. You will learn very soon and you will have the scars to prove it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Samuel. And with that, I need to actually wrap up this panel discussion. It was very enlightening. There are a number of points that came out of this seminar. It's quite clear that within the Caribbean, we do have a number of infrastructural gaps, and with the high levels of indebtedness of our countries, we need to find novel ways of financing these infrastructure requirements. And here today, we spoke about the opportunity of using PPPs for that. It's quite clear to us that we need to have the right people in place if we are to have successful PPPs at the national level and perhaps also at the regional level. Good feasibility studies are important. We need to know the risks. We, as custodians of this infrastructure, of PPPs within our own jurisdictions, need to be aware of what the risks are before we actually invite other parties to be part of it. Political will is also key. And I should just end by saying that coming out of this study and work that the Caribbean Development Bank has been doing with some of the other IFIs, we are actually quite engaged in setting up a PPP unit within the CDB, which will allow us to actually assist our board members to actually assess the viability of many projects at the national level. And of course, there was a question perhaps at the regional level. I think that particular unit will allow us to actually see where synergies can actually come from actually having PPP units at the regional level. I should also say, in response to a comment from China, we're actually in the process of reviewing our private sector strategy. That will allow us to actually provide financing to the private sector that is actually risk-based, perhaps LIBOR plus, and that will be coming to our board of directors sometime later this year. So we are moving within that direction. We understand that we need to lend more to the private sector, but we have to have the right policies in place to allow us to do that. So let me end by thanking all of our panelists who have agreed to be here with us. Thank you for giving us a very informative presentations, and could I ask you to give them a round of applause, please?